Say it's alright, the music's good, 'cause it's alright, it's alright, it's alright, every time, oh, it's alright, oh, it's alright, we're gonna do this slow.
Welcome to Our Stories Matter. I'm Sam Lasalde.
And I'm Susie Hess.
Our Stories Matter is hosted by Trauma Informed LA and the amazing music by Torrance Brandon Reese, founding member of the music group Street Corner Renaissance. Our Stories Matter at Locals Only acknowledges the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Towangar, the Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands. We pay our respects to the Honugvetam, our ancestors, Ahihirom, our elders, and Eohinkem, our relatives and relations past, present, and emerging.
So I am really excited to introduce a friend, Saúl. Saúl Sarabia is an LA native who began his work as a community organizer focused on racial justice and the legal system in 1999 at the Community Coalition in South LA. Today, he runs a political consulting firm called Solidarity and has a part-time appointment at the UCLA Institute for Research on Labor and Employment, where he focuses on the future of work in a decarcerated California. His firm is leading campaigns outreach for George Gascon's LA County DA in the San Fernando Valley, where he has lived for 10 years. Saúl's bio goes on for pages and pages, so we're going to just go into conversation and welcome Saúl.
Welcome, Saúl.
Thank you both. It's great to be here with both of you. I appreciate the invitation to be on this important podcast. Can't wait to get into the conversation with you all, and thanks to folks for listening.
Can you describe for us a little bit your work related to trauma and healing has been?
Sure. First of all, just want to say that as a queer man of color who was raised in poverty here in LA and, I think survived, I'll say that, the 70s and the 80s, I want to just say that, part of my experience with trauma has to do with not having the tools to understand what structures were responsible for the way that societies had treated very poor people, people who are discriminated against based on their identity. And it wasn't until I began to gain critical thinking skills and began to understand the political system that I realized that civic participation, owning my civic voice, taking collective action with other people was healing work, and that participation in a political process in a system that produces trauma through laws, that produces trauma through civic exclusion, through civic death of people who are working to make the country's profits. This was a big realization for me and something that I decided that I would dedicate my life to doing. And I think the briefest way for me to say that is I chose not to reproduce the conditions of my people's oppression by conceding the electoral process, by conceding the political policy-making process to people that profit off of everyone else's trauma, and people who use the legal system and people who use the political process and people who use the policy-making process to profit off of our traumas and to create those traumas in the first place.
I'm wondering if, for our listeners, if you can give us an example or two of what that looks like, that profiting off of trauma, off of community trauma.
Sure. I will start by just saying a little bit about my background. Both my parents are from the northern state of Durango in Mexico, and they lived a life that I see in the kind of movement towards organic food and the demand for respecting nature, for growing local, and for eating what you grow. This was idyllic, what they described to me from their childhood. They are from the deep mountains, 5 hours from the nearest city, where there was no institutions. There was no hospitals to have your kids in. There was a one-room school. Everything that they describe around how people organize their lives, even within poverty and within the context of exclusion in Mexico, was living off of the land, swimming in rivers that were clean, breathing air that didn't know contamination. And at some point, the generation that my parents belonged to in their teens were displaced from their community because if you stayed there and just tried to live off of growing beans and growing maize or corn, you would starve to death. And the political economy between the United States and Mexico began to transform these communities, the small ranch communities. And what emerged was the narco economy that we know now. People now know the name El Chapo. Well, El Chapo controls these vast areas of mountains where families there are now in a situation where you either collaborate and participate in a drug economy, or you starve to death, or you immigrate. And the political decision makers that have made the communities that my parents came from, where life, I'm sure, wasn't simple. I mean, it sounded simple to me when they were describing these things. Or my dad would say to me, when I die, I'm going to leave you 10 cows. And I'm going to, what do I want 10 cows for in this ranch that I'm nowhere near? They've turned these communities into economic hostages to the demand for drugs by Americans and the financial interests of the people in power in Mexico and in the drug cartels that conscript everybody into this economy. And so I often think about my trauma related to growing up in a household that was devastated by drugs, that was devastated by realizing that our family was either addicted to drugs or selling these drugs as part of the underground economy, was, having to come to an analysis of either there's something wrong with us or there's something wrong with the world that uses us in this way. And so I've chosen not to start my story with when I came to realize that that my childhood, would come to an abrupt idyllic end when I realized growing up in Highland Park, surrounded by the Avenues gang, where previous to this time period, gangs existed, but they then were used to move drugs in and out of the neighborhoods. It was no longer like a rite of passage that you kind of went through. It was a part of this drug economy. My experience with addiction as a family member of folks who eventually became addicted or who got locked up for participating in the drug economy, it began to, elevate my trauma from just the exposure to poverty, the exposure to gang violence, to something far more profound that set me on this journey of trying to understand myself and how I fit into the decision-making processes that get visited on these communities. I could tell a story here today that's about fighting to make sure that our laws are laws that prefer rehab over prison. And I could name the Prison Guards Union as a very specific profiting entity off of the trauma of addiction, because they did play a very specific role in the 90s in ensuring that none of our tax money was going to prevent drug use, to deal with rehabilitation, but rather to ensure that people would be going in and out of jail, which many of my families did. But I think it's a much deeper story in which the other actors in the legal system, judges who we often don't think about when they're on the ballot. We don't even know who they are or how to judge them. Prosecutors who run tough on crime campaigns and scare the population into thinking that there's good guys and bad guys when everybody's on the bottom. At least if you're not a gazillionaire, you're pretty much also being profited off of, either as a voter to give these people power, And of course, the non-state entities, whether it is the cartels that we normalize in popular culture, the popular culture of Hollywood that just makes a movie where if you're black and brown and you're pushing the drugs, you're the bad guy. But if you're some glamorous white person from the West Side at a party and doing a line of coke and don't have to think about where it comes from and whose lives is run over, when you have to, have this be part of what you do socially, we're all implicated. And so for me, I think that it's important for us to keep peeling the layers around how all of us are conscripted into these economies of trauma and what we can do to try to undo them at the ballot box and through who we put in power.
Whoa. One, I so appreciate everything that you just said. And you give hope, that we can do something. And especially after this past weekend where RBG died, I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of, addressing trauma through voting. And I think at this point, people are feeling fear, right? Which is what the powers that be want us to feel. They want us to feel fear. And we need the hope and the empowerment. So, yeah, how would you address trauma through voting?
I'm glad that you referred to, the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and additional sort of angst this has produced as we're going into an election in less than a couple months. I think it's important to begin with, again, putting our eye on the prize on the structures of exclusion. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, it hurts us not just because it means Trump might be putting in, and the Republicans might be putting in another far right person into the Supreme Court. It also hurts us because in her story, in her history, there's a very clear portrait of systemic exclusion of human beings from the political process, from the legal system, simply on account of one part of their identity, and that is that she's a woman. And that story, I think, is the part we have to be focused on, which is that story begins with a constitution that excluded women from voting and from being civic actors, the way that it excluded people that did not own property, the way that it excluded people of color. And from that moment to her graduating law school, not being offered jobs, despite the fact that she finished as one of the top two, one of the most competitive schools, everything we know about what pioneers like her do, elevating outside of individual accomplishment and into the fight that people of conscience and people who are part of that identity group that were being excluded have had to do over and over and over to not be trampled on. And so we owe it to those generations of people that made her service possible and those who have expanded way beyond it to be able to not concede elections to the forces that understand that the ballot box, a seat on the Supreme Court, these are vehicles by which you can either reproduce patriarchy and racism, or they are vehicles by which we can produce racial justice and equality. There's no other way to see it. You either are so traumatized that you have accepted apathy, accepted fear, or accepted disillusionment as a justification for participating in your own oppression, for participating in the reproduction of trauma. And when we know about traumas that when they're not treated, right, people who have been harmed other people. They harm themselves and they harm other people. The millions of people that do not vote, the millions of people who don't have faith in the voting process, as people that have, not by accident, they have been traumatized into that paralysis by the way that the legal system and the political system turn people off, right? They're like hard to follow, they purposefully make it, it put it into language that's hard for people to to relate to. It's designed to do this. It's designed to produce all of this. And so I see myself really in many ways as a translator often, and when we talk about when we get into the specifics of like why this office is important, why this candidate is important, why this particular law is important, for people who are not legal, I mean, I'm legally trained, or people who have not gone to college, they probably, right, they got to get up and go to work. They probably think the last thing on their mind is whether or not one of the 9 seats on the Supreme Court goes to someone like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, or the very scary characters that Trump is now considering to put in her place. It is our job to provide language to those folks and to provide an access point for them to understand in your day-to-day life, this is what's affected by that entity, and this is how you can do something about it.
And so like I mean, I think you're touching on it now. Maybe you can draw this out a little bit more for all of our listeners. But how do you see this work that you're doing in bringing healing to our communities? How do you see this as political?
Well, I think that it is a political decision when we get up in the morning and decide that our lives are not going to be organized around how much profit can I make today and what things can I buy with that profit. That is the biggest political decision I make every day, is that even though every message around what I'm supposed to value myself by, what I'm supposed to get up to produce for, I just choose to oppose that in the way that I organize my life. And so doing work that allows people to participate in the policymaking process, in finding a civic voice, and yes, in contesting and challenging power. This to me is politics in the most important sort of way, which is politics that recognize that the world we walk out into after we open the door did not just fall from the sky. It is not the natural order, right? It is just, it's a socially constructed world that is produced by conflicts that happen between groups of people who are trying to determine how the society is organized. And if some people had won, we wouldn't have a weekend and all of us would be enslaved 7 days a week. If some people had won, women still wouldn't have the right to vote. And we see some of those forces actually trying to use a political system to reproduce that now. So for me, there is nothing more political that I can do than to say my job every day is to collectivize with other people who are not in power and who can find our own power by acting together electorally, politically, and as civic actors. Soon after I graduated from college and law school, I had the privilege of becoming a community organizer. And I think Susie said that was at Community Coalition, an organization that was also created during the crack epidemic. It was sort of also created in response to, we're being told that the problem is drugs and the problem is addiction and individual choices, but something deeper is going on here, and in particular to the crack crisis in the Black community. And at that time, the story about Black and brown people in South Central was that, we were animals and couldn't live next to each other without killing each other. And, the LAPD needed to have a batter ram to go after houses, literally smash down houses where they were selling drugs out of. They blocked off entire streets with those big white cement blocks you see on the freeway. All of a sudden you saw them on city blocks and you couldn't do chases, supposedly. They had all of these operations to lock people up, and this was going to be the answer, supposedly, to all that. Well, that organization said no. That organization said the thing that we need to do is organize residents around the root causes of addiction, the root causes of crime, and that has to do with politics, social, economic, and political conditions. And we got to teach them how to get involved in the policymaking process. And that's where I learned community organizer. In the process, I had the privilege of meeting a remarkable woman named Susan Burton, who came to the organization as a person who had been locked up 6 times before anybody asked her what happened, and gave her counseling and eventually stopped going back and forth to prison. And one of the first things that she did when she was finally able to get a job, which with the record, you could not really get a job. She wanted to be a nurse. Can't be a nurse if you have a drug-related felony. We're lifting some of those laws now through this work that we've been able to do with people like Susan. But Susan basically took care of people that didn't have other people to take care of them, elderly people, sick people who didn't care whether you have a record. They were in the same neighborhood and they said, we trust you. Come take care of our mom, come take care of whomever, saves up some money, gets a little bungalow in Watts, 2 bedrooms with a little den. And she decides she's going to put bunk beds in there and she's going to create an organization. She didn't even have a formal 501c3. Like, she didn't think about it as I'm creating a nonprofit. It was just like, I'm doing this mission focused work. And when she did that, she found us. And I was lucky enough to be leading the department at the Community Coalition, where my job was to organize service providers, people like her who had nonprofits. And Susan came to us when we were basically analyzing what the victories had been in the first 10 years and what we needed to focus on in the next 10 years of that organization. And I think that what happened for Susan is that getting involved in community organizing made her think that what nonprofits are supposed to exist for is to get people to become political activists. Because she was right at the beginning. She came and she just it all sank in. And she started to, bring women from her home into our work. And together we realized that model of providing a home, meeting women where they were, giving them access to treatment, supporting them with counseling and making them get in touch with their trauma that was at the root of what was producing the infraction that they were committing that would land them in the legal system. Giving them an opportunity to find their civic voice was an essential part of rehab. And this is one of the only places where I know this to be true, where the rehabilitation model is you need to learn how the political system works and become an activist. And she's an incredible model. She's now replicating her homes across the United States. And she's also somebody who's become a leader in this new social movement to empower formerly incarcerated people. So I think if formerly incarcerated people who have been made invisible by, like on paper, they literally take away your right to vote in certain states, undocumented people who are involved in the kind of work that I do, calling other voters, getting them to understand what the DA's office can do to make sure that you don't end up in deportation when you are arrested for a particular crime, young people who are not even old enough to vote. These 3 populations don't even have the right to vote, and they cannot afford to be apathetic. They cannot afford to be disillusioned. They cannot afford to be fearful. In fact, their recovery, their ability to be full citizens in the broadest term of the word, depends on them being able to touch that part of them that says, I want to have a political voice and I can move other people, whether or not I'm the one who's going to go into the ballot, whether or not I have a right yet to go and do that because I'm 16, because I don't have a green card, because I'm on parole, although one of the propositions we're going to vote on this year, Proposition 17, would allow parolees to vote. So these kinds of examples, I think, should tell the rest of us, even when you're feeling like people are feeling apocalyptic right now, aren't they, with the fires and everything? There are people in much more difficult situations. I mean, our biggest example, of course, is slavery, right? And the people who are the descendants of the slaves in this country, they have really given us an entire social movement through the civil rights movement that moved this whole country, not just them, closer to what a democracy is supposed to be. So I would just ask for us to be inspired and to look at those examples or what it must have felt like to be pushing for these things, to push for these things when you are categorically excluded and invisibilized by the system. Let's not do that to ourselves because it seems hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Absolutely. And I so appreciate everything you just said, because you really are focused on community healing through voting. And everything that you just said, and one in particular is really understanding what happened to you. And trauma-informed approaches, changes that question from what's wrong with you to understanding what happened to you. So community healing through voting is so powerful, and through activism. And of course, Susan Burton is like the perfect example of that. When I met you, I knew immediately I wanted to go to you for elections. So I just started emailing, and this is true, Saúl, saying, hey, I just met you it was actually through Chantel Vachani. And do you have a cheat sheet for my voting? Well, I knew that we aligned a lot. And I really wanted you to interpret for me what I was voting for, because I still am having challenges in terms of understanding the voting. So my question for you is, folks who would like to either research, get involved, find out more about the elections, the propositions, how can they either get involved with you? Where can they research? What do you recommend?
It's funny that you give that example, because I think, people, for good reason, and I don't want to say that people feel disillusioned just because they choose to. People feel disillusioned for good reason, which is that we have a political system that is less and less responsive to your day-to-day lives. And so, of course, it's easy to start feeling like you should take yourself out of it. And then the worst next step is you start to then become susceptible to conspiracy theories and stories that somebody who's profiting off of you permanently taking yourself out of the electoral process wants you to believe, so that you don't no longer have faith in anything or anyone, much less yourself. And so my family started to say, hey, you need to come and tell us, how to vote, or just send me your recommendations. And I said, you know what? I'm not going to do that. I'm happy to come and facilitate a discussion, and let's just start having family voting parties. There's other things you have to figure out how to understand for your kids. You can develop a muscle around this, and you can develop your own understanding of how a particular proposition got on the ballot, who put it there, who's on the yes side and who's on the no side, and debate it and check it out with other people. Trust other people and listen to what they're saying. Listen who's on which side, and that by itself is going to tell you some story. Well, this has turned out to be one of the most cherished, I guess, family traditions, and people start to call me, and you add a little bit of alcohol, and then it's just really fun. So yeah, have family voting parties, bring it all together. You know who your crazy, relatives are. In terms of coming in prepared, I want to just share a couple of resources that I want to honor people's labor. So when I started to look into this, I did two things. So one is, in Spanish, there's a saying, dime con quién andas y te diré quién eres, right? Which is, tell me who you hang with, tell me who you roll with, and I'll tell you who you are. And so I do make it a point to check out websites of left-leaning parties, because that's how I identify politically, websites of racial justice organizations, because sometimes left-leaning organizations don't have a good racial justice analysis. And sometimes racial justice civil rights organizations don't have a far left enough analysis. And so I try to mix those in. And then I try to go to pages where over more than one election, the person posting on this, and I do think this has been one of the good things about the internet, is that individuals who, do this because they like it or whatever, not because they belong to one of those parties, have had a track record of explaining things in ways that are like plain English. And one of the ones I want to recommend that I do use is called Pete Rates the Propositions. It's this dude who I think actually just works for an orchestra up north. And he basically just turned it into a hobby. And he's like a nerd that studies state politics. And he does a pretty good job of translating into plain English each of the propositions. And so I do recommend PeteRates.com as one of the places that I draw from when I do my own recommendations, and even just to debate, because I also sometimes don't agree. My political analysis is different than the Green Party, the Democratic Party, maybe a civil rights organization or here and there. And so what I do is I try to then synthesize all of those things, and usually 90% of the stuff will be easy, right? Like right now that the KKK has essentially taken over the Republican Party, it's pretty easy. You just look for what are the Republicans are in favor of, and you vote the other way, and you could pretty much go to sleep at night with a good conscience. And I don't have any qualm saying that nowadays, because if you're a Republican, I don't care if you're in the state of California, this is what you're participating in. This is what you're harboring. And you are as complicit as Donald Trump in everything that you feel horrified by, even if you say, I'm a Republican, but I'm not a Trump supporter. That distinction is no longer legible. When the Supreme Court vote comes up, they're going to all vote the way that Trump wants them to vote. You know, the one thing I appreciate about Trump is that he has taken the Band-Aid off or lifted the white hood off of everybody. And so if you don't have a problem endorsing the views of, as a party or around a candidate that is doing all of the things that are visible and using the words that he uses to do them. We don't want people from shithole countries. Why can't we have immigrants from Norway or Denmark and not El Salvador and Haiti? That is not coded language. That is explicit, not implicit bias. And if you are under that tent, then you are part of the issue. So I don't have a problem saying to you that a pretty safe bet is to, you know, find what the Republicans are for and go against it. And then, of course, in California, where I owe this phrase to a scholar in my field of critical race studies. His name is Daniel Ho-Sung Martinez. He wrote a really important book that everybody should read about race and the propositions in California since World War II. And it's called Racial Propositions. And it's not so much around propositions that have to do with race. He has a really interesting research question, which is, how could the liberal state of California also be the place where, if you look on the ballot, what voters have voted for, only one of the major civil rights propositions has ever passed when he wrote the book. And that was basically stopping the same guy who made affirmative action, a black man named Ward Connerly, who made affirmative action an issue and put it on the ballot so that it could be invalidated. It's now back on the ballot and we're able to restore it by voting yes on 16. He basically is writing about something he calls blue state racism. So our job's a little bit harder, which is we cannot trust that the Democrats also aren't promoting things that are maybe not as bad as the Republicans, and they feel great because they're not the KKK party, but they can be pretty bad. And I'll just give you the example around my field, criminal justice. How did the state of California, the left coast, the bluest state on the map, also become the site of the most vicious expansion of racialized mass incarceration since 1980? Well, the Democrats have been participants in that. They've taken money from the Prison Guards Union. And their refusal to kick off the police, to take a very big actor in politics, which is labor, and force a conversation with labor and dislodge labor from the project of mass incarceration and of the racism in it, is what we're living with right now. So yes, do your research. Don't necessarily just go by whether one party or one organization you're with is in favor of something, but talk it out. Read the analysis, and where you have questions, reach out to folks. I am not on any other platforms except for Facebook, where I gladly post my recommendations. So if anybody wants to find me on Facebook, my first name is Saúl, my last name is Sarabia. There's not too many people with that name, but I usually just says LA, California. I should add Raider fan on there, right? And yeah, I will put those on there, and then, you know, it starts debate, and there's some really smart people on my Facebook feed like Susie. And, you know, people talk to each other, and maybe if they try to scream at each other, you know, we just have to deal with that as part of it. But I do want to end on this point, because there is a big reform around our prison system that I think could reproduce trauma in our community. And that is Proposition 25 around eliminating bail. It has really divided the progressive racial justice community. People who believe that it's time to kill an industry that profits off of incarceration, and communities of color in particular see this as a major step forward, and they want folks to vote yes. People who read the details and see that this still will give judges the discretion to not give bail to everybody, and that those judges are, many of them, racist, that's going to be a bigger problem. And also, it gives too much power to the algorithms. They have justifications for why they want you to vote no. It's picking your poison between those two things, and it would be a whole other podcast to debate it out. But what I want to say that I've seen that I don't think is healthy for us is people accusing each other of reproducing racial oppression or reproducing class oppression by voting one way or the other. And I think I would just want to say, let's just recognize the electoral system in a system of politics that is built for the powerful is not the place for us to break our friendships. We just got to study, pick our poison, and then move forward.
I'm glad you said that right now at the end. We would need a whole nother episode. We're limited in time, but I think you touched on a few different things that I want to explore more with you, in particular when you started going into mass incarceration and the fact that here we are, a blue state, and we're leading that charge. In closing, just I really want to thank you for coming on with us and sharing all of this with us.
For sure. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you all for your work. I think centering healing is a really important way to talk about voting. This is a really important contribution you're making.
Thank you so much, Saúl. I mean, I'm just so grateful that the world can hear your voice. I feel lucky that I have met you, and I'm totally relying on you like every 4 years and in between as well. Healing through voting is what we need. And everyone who's listening, vote.
That's right. Talk to you all soon. And after you vote, get involved with an organization.
Thank you, Saúl. Our Stories Matter is brought to you by Trauma Informed LA, whose mission is to foster resilient communities that promote healing and well-being through collaboration, education, and community engagement. Check us out on Facebook and Instagram at Trauma Informed LA and our website, traumainformedla.org. Please give us 5 stars on iTunes so more folks can have access, and donate to traumainformedla.org so we can keep recording and healing through our storytelling episodes.